Everyone. My name is Leslie Spees. I'm with Influence HR Consulting and going to do a presentation for you on performance management that doesn't suck. I usually like to start my presentations talking about what the problem is that we're trying to solve. And in this case, it's that most organizations don't do performance management very well. Here's what we'll cover: what performance management is, why it often sucks, and what you can do about it. So sounds easy enough, right? First thing I want to do is define performance management. A lot of times people just think of performance management as being the performance review or performance appraisal process, whatever term you use for it. But it is much more than that. It's all the elements of managing performance in your organization. So coaching, feedback, positive and developmental, goals and expectations, performance reviews, correction, and accountability is in the center of all of that. So why is performance management important? It fosters engagement, productivity, and retention by ensuring that everybody knows what's expected, how they perform, and what they need to improve or achieve next. It can also help align employee efforts with broader organizational goals, which helps the whole organization's success. So we can't really do a poll in this format, but just like for you to think about how you rate performance management in your organization. And I also want you to think about your worst executed performance review story. So I have quite a few. And for the purposes of the presentation today, we've talked about performance management being broader, but we're really going to focus on that performance review or performance appraisal piece. So I'll share a few of my stories. I've been in the workplace a long time. I've had a lot more poorly executed reviews than those that were done well. So back in the day, I had one manager that filled out my form, put it in my box because we had mailboxes back in the day, and basically just told me to pick it up. And she went on vacation and we never talked about it. I had another that provided the ratings, filled out the form and everything. And, we sat down to talk about it, and her ratings weren't quite what I thought reflected my performance. And I asked for some examples, and she said, I just must not have been in a good mood that day. And then I had another that I went in for the meeting, and the first 15 minutes was her just shuffling around, trying to find the form, which had not been completed, taking other calls, things like that. When we finally did talk, it was basically everything's fine. And let's sign this form and get this done. So, some of my stories. I'd love to hear some of yours if you want to share them online or anything. Reasons most performance reviews suck. So these are some that I thought of. You may have some additional ones. More than 75% of employees and managers feel that results are ineffective and or inaccurate. Everybody dreads them. They can be demotivating. Studies show that performance ratings do not correlate with business results or actual performance. They're often just focused on the past and they're not frequent enough. So if you're still just doing an annual performance review, and not having other methods of communication, that is not going to impact performance at all, and probably, if anything, in a negative way. And managers often don't know how to conduct them effectively, or they may not have them at all. This little lady's still waiting. So, some components of an effective performance review process. And actually, I prefer another term to the performance review, which is performance conversations. So, it discusses performance data, recognizes employee contributions, gives actionable advice, explores career growth, and is forward focused and not just focused on the past. There is a better way. I think sometimes we overcomplicate it. So best method is keep it simple, stupid. Do an improved process. You don't need a fancy, time-consuming process or system. You build regular performance conversations into your culture, and you should already be doing one-on-ones on a regular basis. And really, what I'm going to recommend to you is just kind of like an expanded one-on-one that you do with some frequency. So I recommend quarterly, but even if it's every 6 months, that's better than once a year. Performance conversations are more frequent, collaborative conversations about performance. They include open-ended questions, goal setting, and development. To create your process, and we'll go through each of these things, but you want to establish key results areas for positions, include core values, determine open-ended questions to use, incorporate goals. So if you do it quarterly, I recommend 2 performance and 1 development, and decide whether to include a self-assessment. I personally like the self-assessment component, but it does complicate things a little bit. All right, so let's start with key result areas. These are areas of responsibility or focus where outcomes are expected as part of a role or part of a team. So with this, every position, there should be 5-ish really important things that are a part of that position. And then you've probably heard the term key performance indicators or KPIs. That's how you measure your KRA. So an example for a customer service rep might be provide excellent customer service by meeting service level agreements or SLAs for email response, telephone response time, and customer service feedback expectations. So I'm not a big fan of ratings, and they've been shown to be fairly ineffective. But if you like ratings and you have more of a metric-oriented position or culture, here's how I recommend doing it. So I recommend 3 buckets: needs improvement, meets expectations, and exceeds expectations. So you'll see in this example, it very clearly defines what each of those are, which would help with any rater bias or ineffective rating, excuse me. So needs improvement, email and call response time is often below expected SLA levels. Customer feedback ratings are below average. Meets expectation, consistently meets SLAs for email and phone response time. Customer feedback consistently meets expectations, and often exceeds SLAs for email and phone response time. Customer feedback is frequently above average. You want to include core values. So core values are the fundamental beliefs and guiding principles that shape an organization's culture, behavior, and decision-making. It's important for employees to consistently demonstrate the core values for your organization to build and have a positive work culture. And I feel like core values are underutilized in a lot of companies that either don't have them or don't leverage them effectively. One of the ways that you can leverage them more is to incorporate them into the performance conversations. So I recommend having 3 to 6. You don't want to have too many. So here's an example. If you decided you wanted to use ratings, then you could use this process. So we'll say in this company, accountability is one of the core values. And that's defined as taking ownership of actions and results, holding ourselves and each other accountable, honoring commitments, and taking responsibility for delivering on our promises. So it might look like this. So again, you've got your 3 levels, and I won't read these to you, but I think you probably get the idea. The other thing that you can do, if you prefer to keep it more open-ended, you can list out the core values, ask employees to share how they think they've demonstrated the core values, what they've done well, what could be improved, and then you share your thoughts and comments. Open-ended questions. So there's different questions you can incorporate. Some that I like are describe your accomplishments during this period. And what I mean by that is since the last conversation, what were your challenges or setbacks? What did you learn from them? What are you doing? How are you doing in the core value areas? What are you doing well? What could you work on? Review the KRAs if applicable, what has gone well, what could be improved. Again, you can use that 3-level rating, or you can just keep it more conversational, depending on what works for your organization. What support do you need from me as your manager? You want to include goals as part of the process. So they are very important to successful performance management. You want to make them SMART. I feel like everybody probably knows what that is, but specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. And you want to have regular discussions about them. So I've worked with some clients in my role as a consultant that have processes where they set the goals during performance management and never talk about them again. So you want to definitely keep the conversation going. And one of the things on goals, you may have goals that are cascaded within your organization. So, in many organizations, and it's a great process to start with the strategic goals and then kind of filter them down so that everybody is working towards success in those areas. But wherever you can, include the employee in the discussion around the goals that are being set within the parameters that they need to be, and incorporate performance and development goals. Here's a sample performance goal for a CSR. Increase your adherence to our service level agreement concerning email response time to 85% by 3/1/25. And we'll assume that filters up to a larger organizational goal around customer service. A sample development goal, and this is certainly something where you can collaborate with them, ask them what they would like to learn in the next 90 days. So an example here might be elevate customer service and leadership skills by reading the Fred Factor and leading a book study for the department. Okay, so we've talked about performance conversations. We've talked about kind of what's recommended as components of that. Now let's talk about 3 steps to high impact performance conversations. So number 1, you need to have clear expectations. You want to define the roles and responsibilities, create your KRAs and KPIs, all of the little acronyms, provide specific goals with measurements and deadlines, and explain the why behind them. That's going to get people more invested and engaged. And you want to connect it in with the overarching purpose. So people are going to be more engaged in their work if they feel like they are a part of something that's bigger than themselves and that they're working towards contributing to the organization's overall purpose. Communicate clearly and repeatedly. So don't just communicate the expectations one time and expect that people remember. Do it on a regular basis. Have regular check-ins to reinforce and evaluate progress, and encourage two-way communication along the way. All right, so you've got your expectations. Now you're going to provide regular feedback on how they're doing with those expectations and not just wait for the performance conversation. So provide timely and specific positive and developmental feedback. Have regular check-ins, and I recommend having like a loose agenda, because what I find is that a lot of managers don't do a great job with their check-in or one-on-one meetings. It's more like, how you doing? Update me. Okay, see you next time. So I like this little agenda. Check in on the employee personally. Ask them what's going well, where they've struggled since your last meeting. Review expectations and project status. Provide update, ask them for an update on their goals, and ask them what support is needed. And then I like incorporating a couple of coaching questions in there as well. Some more tips related to feedback. Don't wait until the performance conversation to give feedback. There shouldn't be any surprises when you get to that conversation. Give feedback and keep information along the way so that you don't focus on the most recent examples. So with the annual performance review, guess what happens? Really, people focus on just the last few months because that's what they remember most of the time. So you'll be having these conversations more frequently, but it's still important to keep information to remind yourself of things that have happened along the way. So keep a little file, whether it's electronic or paper file, to have that information handy. All right, 3rd step, have the performance conversation. So the components, as we talked about, self-assessment, if applicable, KRAs, core values, open-ended questions, and goals. How it works. If you do the self-assessment component, employee completes the self-assessment and sends it to their manager. You may have an HR system or some kind of a system where you can do this online. If you don't, it's not that difficult to do it on paper. The manager reviews their information and adds comments. So I like the self-assessment because it gives employees a chance to share, and there's probably things that the manager doesn't remember or hasn't considered. So reading that information is going to be helpful to them in completing their section as well. Schedule the discussion. When you have the discussion, we'll talk about some tips for making it better, but make it a two-way discussion, finalize the document, and have regular follow-up conversations. Things not to do. So Michael Scott from the office, along with most other management tasks, probably not great at performance reviews. Things not to do are talk the whole time, not be prepared and or rush through it as clearly he is from the image, not listen, compare employees in the review, focus on the most recent information only and not follow up. You don't want to give feedback that isn't appropriate or useful. If you need to talk to somebody about their BO, don't save it for the performance conversation. Don't make it inconsistent with actual performance. So as a HR professional for a really long time, I have seen this happen so many times where a manager would come to me and say, this employee's performance is terrible. We really need to fire them or put them on a final written warning. I go back to the performance review, which was done recently, and they received a rating of exceeds expectations. So you want to make sure that you are making it reflective of actual performance. Making the most of the meeting. Make it a dialogue, ask the employee to share, and then add your comments. Sit on the same side of the table if you can. That just makes it seem more collaborative. Listen actively as they share, minimize distractions, and give them your undivided attention, going along with the active listening, and be honest. All right, so we've talked about the components, we've talked about some steps to implement, or some steps to actually make them most effective. Now let's talk about how to implement them. You want to customize a process that makes sense for your organization and the positions in your organization. So you definitely want to give that some thought. I've shared some suggestions around structure, but you got to do what makes sense for your organization. Garner senior leader support and input. Once you have that, you have your new process. You want to train managers. We miss the boat on that a lot. And I think the training is more than just how to have a performance review. You need to train managers to be better coaches. So that includes giving feedback, positive and developmental in a motivational way, listening well, coaching rather than fixing and giving advice all the time, and having these types of conversations effectively. Announce the new process to employees, share the specific format and the why behind it, launch and monitor over time. The end result is performance management that doesn't suck. Okay, so here is my contact information. If you have any questions or you'd like any assistance in building your performance management, performance conversation approach, please feel free to reach out. There are some free resources if you go to the QR code, which is shown here. Thank you so much for joining me.